Okay, so do I think that methodological naturalism is the correct way of approaching history? I'm only going to mention history in this video. This may also be relevant for science as well, but I want to talk about methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is basically the thesis that we are going to assume that only natural explanations exist for any kind of historical event or historical phenomenon, right? This can also be applied into science. Some people will say we can only appeal to scientific or natural explanations for science. We can't appeal to God or to demons or to angels, right? Everything has to be a natural entity in order for us to appeal to it. So, one example that is obviously very relevant to me is the resurrection of Jesus. A lot of scholars, Bart Ehrman, for example, will argue for methodological naturalism, and they'll say historians cannot discern miracles, right? So even if a miracle did occur, history would not be able to discern it because it's inherently a philosophical / theological question, and we can't be baking in assumptions about philosophy or theology when we're doing history. We have to try and be as neutral as possible. And I think there's something to that. I think there's something to that, which is why I don't want to abandon methodological naturalism. I don't want to abandon it. But I do want to restrict it or limit it, right? So I think that we can affirm as historians a limited version of methodological naturalism while still allowing for it to not be a kind of metaphysical absolute or a methodological absolute. So my view on it is that as a pragmatic assumption, I think methodological naturalism, which I'm going to refer to as MN, I think that's fine. I think as a kind of just a pragmatic assumption, something we're going to assume when we're doing history, I think it's fine. I think it's fine in the vast majority of cases. But I don't want to say that we should restrict ourselves to natural explanations. Because I think that as long as it is a live epistemic possibility that there is a God that causally interacts with the world, or that there are supernatural agents that causally interact with the world, as long as that is a live epistemic possibility, as long as it's at least somewhat plausible, I don't think we should be ruling it out a priori. I think we should, at the very least, consider it as a potential explanation, look at its explanatory merits, maybe look at however simple it is or however intrinsically probable it is, and evaluate it just like we would any other theory. And so I don't think positing a miracle or positing a supernatural explanation necessarily commits us to theism or it's going to commit you to non-naturalism, right? Which is a philosophical, it's a metaphysical opinion, right? Or metaphysical position. But I would want to approach it from an agnostic perspective. I would want to say that when we're doing history, we shouldn't be, at least academically, when we're doing history, we shouldn't be assuming any kind of metaphysics in the background. There shouldn't be any presuppositions of theism or naturalism. And so non-naturalism, non-theism, these are just agnostic categories. We don't want to assume naturalism or theism, is what I think. I think what we can say is that in most cases, a naturalistic explanation will suffice. It will explain all of the relevant data, and if a naturalistic explanation explains all the data and there's good evidence for it, then I think we should accept it. Now, I want to argue for a restricted version of MN. I think that MN is good in most cases, and I think we should use it and we should assume it when we're doing history. But I think that if 4 criteria have been met, I think we have good grounds and we are sufficiently justified in abandoning methodological naturalism to look towards some kind of non-natural explanation. And those four criteria, I would say, are: one, no natural explanation can sufficiently explain all of the relevant data. Two, a non-natural explanation can explain all of the relevant data. Three, the non-natural explanation has to be magnitude times better than any ad hoc combination of naturalistic theories. And then four, we need to have good reasons to think that a non-naturalist explanation would be plausible in this scenario. So the fourth one may be theism. We may have to think theism is true. It may be, we may have to think that Jesus is the kind of person that a God would want to resurrect. But whatever it is, we need to think, at the very least, that there are no good naturalistic explanations. There is at least one good supernatural, I don't want to say supernatural, non-natural explanation. And then three, there are some good reasons to think that the non-natural explanation is actually going to be plausible. And so I think in most cases we're probably not going to be able to use history to discern miracles. I'm not interested in ruling it out a priori. I don't like having to say that. I'm not even going to consider it as a viable option, the idea that a miracle or a non-natural explanation is the explanation for a particular historical phenomenon. I don't want to say that because I want to be cautious about what I'm affirming and what I'm dismissing when I'm doing history. Now, my opinion is that even as a Christian, I don't think history can discern the resurrection of Jesus. I think most likely it's a faith belief. But I think if you combine history with philosophy and theology, then I think you can start to get to approximating a justified belief in the resurrection of Jesus, or I should say a plausible belief in the resurrection of Jesus. I think you can be justified in believing in the resurrection on several different grounds that maybe I'll go over in another video. But I think from just a historical perspective, there are sufficient naturalistic explanations for the resurrection. And I don't want to make this video on the resurrection, right? But I think there are sufficient natural explanations for it that aren't incredibly ad hoc. I still think the resurrection is a much simpler and much better explanation. But because there are explanations that I think are somewhat sufficient to explain belief in the resurrection, from a strictly historical perspective, I would most likely go with the naturalistic explanation, even at rejecting an absolute methodological naturalism, even believing in a kind of restricted MN, which is what I do accept, a kind of restricted version of it. I still think the resurrection is not going to be correct, not going to be something that we should assume is going to be the correct explanation for the historical events. Why? Because I don't think it passes all four of the criteria. I think there are sufficient naturalistic explanations that are not incredibly ad hoc. And then I'm also skeptical of the last one, which is that we need to think that God would have good reasons for wanting to resurrect Jesus. That's going to presuppose certain things about the Bible being reliable in its portrayal of how Jesus acted and how he interacted with God. So I think there's going to be a lot of things we're going to have to presuppose that I'm not entirely convinced of. And so for me personally, I wouldn't accept the resurrection on simply historical grounds. Now, while that is the limit of history, and that's all historians can do, I do want to say that I think it's still possible to get to the resurrection on a combination of philosophical, historical, and theological grounds. So, Richard Swinburne is one of my favorite philosophers, and he has a book called The Resurrection of God Incarnate, in which he argues for the resurrection of Jesus by not looking at it from a strictly historical perspective. He includes into the background information God's existence and certain things about Jesus' life. So he says that, we should think that a priori there are good reasons for God to want to be incarnate, right? So he's not just saying that, okay, well, the historical evidence points towards the resurrection of Jesus. He's already plugging a lot of stuff into the background so we can update on this and evaluate it when we're actually evaluating the evidence for the resurrection. So what he'll say is, okay, well, we have good reasons to think that a God would want to be incarnate to atone for sins and to show people how to live their life, right? And so we have good reason to think that there would be an incarnate God. He assigns it a 1/2 probability, which is way too high. And it's way too high, but he assigns it a 1/2 probability. Secondly, well, before he does that, he talks about God's existence. He says that we have good reasons to think that God exists. So he says the probability that God exists is roughly 1/2. I think that's fine. He says that given God's existence, we should think that the probability of God being incarnate is roughly 1/2. So he thinks that the probability of God existing is 1/4, because you want 1/2 of 1/2 is 1/4, right? And so once we put all of that into the background information, then he uses Bayes' theorem to look at specific pieces of evidence from the Bible or from the Gospels, and to make specific points about the way Jesus lived. And he says, okay, well, we have good reasons to think that Jesus was a special kind of person, right? Jesus wasn't just a normal guy, right? And that's part of the reason why we should think his resurrection is more likely than not, right? If Jesus was just some random dude who didn't do anything and people saw him 2 days later or had experiences of him 2 days later, there'd be why would we think that God would want to raise him from the dead? It's sure, maybe the historical evidence points towards that, but if there's no reason to even think that, then we're looking at a very, very low intrinsic probability of it, just saying. And so he argues that on historical grounds, we can say that Jesus was the kind of person who God would want to resurrect. So now he's including certain things about the Gospel's reliability into the background information. So we're not just looking at the evidence for the resurrection. We're looking at philosophy, right? We're looking at God's existence. We're looking at the probability of God becoming incarnate. We're looking at the specific life and teachings of Jesus. And then once we've already included all of that into the background information, then we can look at the actual evidence for the resurrection. We can look at Paul's conversion. We can look at the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. We can look at the I'm not going to say the Gospels, but we can look at the fact that Peter started a church in Rome with Paul, and Peter was a very early convert to Christianity. We know that he was probably the first person to convert, to have this kind of experience of Jesus. And we know that the 1 Corinthians Creed records that probably Jesus appeared to the 12. So we can say probably there was some kind of group setting in which these experiences occurred. And so we can say all of that. And we can say that most likely scholars are going to agree that the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is probably pretty early. And so I think if we do all of that stuff, right, we talk about philosophy, we talk about theology, we talk about the gospel reliability, then if we do all of that, maybe we can get to a resurrection. Maybe I'll have a longer video on the resurrection at one point. I don't really know when, but I don't think any historian should accept the resurrection on purely historical grounds, unless they've already accepted that God exists and that Jesus is the kind of person who God would want to resurrect. I think we're going to have to assume those two things, which the historian should not assume. And so even though I think methodological naturalism has flaws, I think we should have a restricted version of it where we only use it when it meets specific criteria, and we abandon it when it does not meet those criteria. But nevertheless, I do think it's a good pragmatic assumption that we should assume when we're doing history, and for that point, science as well. And so while I am a critic of methodological naturalism, I'm also a fan of it. But I just think we need to be very cautious when we're creating methodologies, when we're deciding on how we're going to come to knowledge about particular historical facts. I think we should be very cautious about ruling certain things out a priori, or only being interested in gaining a particular kind of knowledge. I don't think that arguing for a miracle, arguing for a resurrection on purely historical grounds, while I do think it's implausible, because I think the resurrection is going to have a very low intrinsic probability if we don't already think God exists. Nevertheless, I still don't think it should be ruled. It should be excluded a priori, or I don't think there's any kind of category error. I don't think this is philosophy or theology we're doing if we're just saying that a non-natural explanation occurred, a non-natural event, or if we're saying a miracle occurred. Some people define miracles as acts of God. Some people define them as suspensions of natural law. If we're understanding them as suspensions of natural law, that doesn't require God. If we're understanding them as acts of God, then that's going to require God, right? So maybe we should start to think, maybe instead of saying miracle, we should say non-natural explanation. But at the very least, my main point is that I think philosophers of history, philosophers of science, whatever, people who are developing the methodology that we're going to be using in these disciplines, whether it's the natural sciences, the social sciences, history, whatever, I think we need to be very cautious when we're ruling out certain explanations a priori.